A few months ago, I found and then downloaded the script of a play from 1908 titled The Traveling Salesman. Now, it took me forever, but I finally, over the weekend, read it, and I was like, this is a great story, but what's even more interesting, to me at least, is the whole premise. And the premise is based on an honest salesperson in 1908. That's what makes it so compelling at the time. So for this episode, I'm going to take you through the play, but along the way, tie it back to today and the lessons we can learn from it. So welcome to the Sales History Podcast.
Welcome to the Sales History Podcast, the show that uncovers the forgotten stories, ideas, pioneers, and moments that shaped the sales profession and what they can teach us about selling, leading, and earning trust today. Here's your host, three-time award-winning author, certified speaking professional keynote speaker, go-to-market sales trainer, and sales nerd, Todd Caponi.
We're heading back to 1908. There was a play called The Traveling Salesman that opened in New York on August 10th of 1908. It was produced by a guy named Henry B. Harris, written by James Forbes, who then staged it himself. But according to the Internet Broadway database, the production played the Liberty Theater, then moved to the Gaiety Theater in September. Those are both Broadway, and ultimately ran for 280 performances. So this did really, really well. The Library of Congress even has a 1908 theatrical poster for it. It says on it, Henry B. Harris presents The Traveling Salesman, a comedy by James Forbes, author of The Chorus Lady. If you want to see it, it's the cover image for this episode. And the show was so popular that it had a life beyond the stage. So it was adapted into a silent film in 1916 and again in 1921. It was starring Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. Now, you might not know who that is, but Arbuckle at the time was very famous as a comedic actor. He may have been the first one to make $1 million in a year, and that was 1919. That's like an insane amount of money today. He was actually a guy that suffered when we talk about actors getting canceled, well, he suffered a 1921 era cancellation, and for good reason at the time. He was accused of murder. Now, he was fully acquitted. Turned out the whole story was crazy, but it ruined his career. But anyway, let's get back to the sales piece on this. This play was set during a time of one of the profession's lowest trust eras. So it came out in 1908, but it was set in the 1800s. Lower than the trust people have even in salespeople today, of course. It was during the age of the drummer, which is a subject I'd done a podcast on. The last episode, we talked about drummers too, but the drummer was the traveling salesperson that was known for telling jokes, slapping backs, getting prospects drunk, being super smooth, and going town to town, charming people out of their money. So for those not caught up on all the episodes here, here's a quick Cliff's Notes of the history of commerce in the United States. So in the early days of American commerce, many sellers were local. They were known. If you bought from the person down the street, reputation had gravity. Right? Like if they cheated you, everybody knew. So that's the early days. But then came the era of national distribution, which came along with railroads and mass manufacturing, and the traveling salesperson emerged. Suddenly, you'd have these strangers arriving in town with samples of the goods. There's promises, prices no one could easily verify. That the buyer had less information. The seller had more. And that imbalance created suspicion, as you might imagine. These drummers typically reinforce that suspicion through their own behaviors. Now, over time, professional selling tried to clean that up. My sales idols like Arthur Sheldon and John Patterson were establishing sales schools, codes of conduct, service-based selling, relationship selling, consultative selling. And so for a period during the early 1900s, the salesperson became, at least aspirationally, trusted, respected, and even in some cases admired. During the early 1920s, the economy stalled. It created something called the Forgotten Depression of the early 1920s. Manufacturers had too much supply, too many idle machines, and that was really expensive. So the era of high pressure sales approaches began. And that was the beginning of the end of the respect of this rebuilt profession once again. So today, though, I want to tell you the story of the play that sat right in the middle of that older, untrusted era. Again, James Forbes' The Traveling Salesman. The play opens on Christmas Day in the waiting room of a small-town railroad depot called Grand Crossing. The script describes the scene, like you see a ticket window, a telegraph instrument with frosted windows, there was a potbelly stove, a baggage room, train schedules, there was a no smoking sign, which is interesting for that time. There were slot machines, which I need to dig into. That's also interesting to me. And a tax sale notice, which I will explain. Now, it's important because at the time, the train depot was a popular spot. You had strangers coming and going, goods and information coming and going through there. And it was a place where telegrams were received. It's kind of where the local community met the outside world back then. In the middle of the train depot sat a woman named Beth Elliott. She was the telegraph operator. She's young, capable, independent, and working for a living. Now, back to the tax notice. Beth owned a piece of land inherited from her father, but it is about to be sold to settle unpaid taxes. Now, everyone in the town thinks the land is worthless. That they actually called it Elliott Stone Pile after Beth Elliott, and named after her family. But as you might be able to guess, it turns out it isn't worthless. The town all thinks the land is just a pile of rocks. Now, certainly Beth is sentimental to it because it was her inheritance, her memory, sacrifice, kind of her identity. However, to the railroad, it's strategic. And to a trader or investor, it's a profit. So you've got one piece of land. You've got 4 different perspectives of value. All right, so let's talk about the lesson there. It might be a stretch, but value is in the eye of the beholder. It's part of this idea I often rant about that's so well encapsulated by Antonio Damasio, who wrote in the 1990s that, quote, "We are not thinking machines that feel. We are feeling machines that think." So we've got to establish a feeling before assigning value to it, right? So that's part of what we're talking about here. There's the logical argument, but it's actually the feeling that drives decisions. So let's keep going. Now we enter the schemer. There was a guy named Franklin Royce. All right, so Franklin Royce, he works for a guy named Martin Drury. So Franklin Royce, Martin Drury. Martin Drury is a powerful businessman. Drury has learned through inside information that the railroad needs Beth's land for a new track spur. He tells Royce they need to get the land before Beth understands its value. All right, so Royce is also interested in Beth romantically, but he is also willing to exploit her ignorance, of course. Now, Martin Drury, the businessman, tells him essentially, don't be sentimental, money talks. All right, so we've got a guy sent in to protect information asymmetry, meaning one side knows what the asset, the land, is actually worth, while the other has no idea. The side that knows the value is seeking to take advantage of that fact, using its information to create an unfair deal. That's the core of untrust, and something the sales world did all the time during its most untrustworthy eras. Now walks in the drummer, right? We talked about the drummer, Bob Blake. All right, so remember, Bob Blake. Bob is the traveling salesman of the title. In the language of the time, he's a drummer. He gets off at the wrong stop. He's confused about where he is and ends up at Beth's ticket window. So remember, this is considered like a romantic comedy. So the dialogue between Bob and Beth is a classic old stage banter. Like he's being charming, she's sharp, he pushes, she pushes back, he flirts, she doesn't make it easy. Like there's that whole going back and forth. And then because it's Christmas and they're both lonely, essentially, Beth shares her lunch with him. Now that scene is kind of the heart of Act 1. It's two strangers eating together in a train depot. That they're eating turkey and bread and mince pie, and then they're sharing a glass drink between the two of them. Now, in the conversation, as they get to know each other, Bob learns about Beth's land. He also learns what it means to her. And Beth, of course, learns that he's a traveling salesman, which immediately complicates everything. Because worse than today, like I said, traveling salesman is not a neutral job title. It's immediately untrusted. So we move to Act 2. Bob talks with his fellow salespeople at the hotel. Like, that's what they do. So they find a hotel room, these drummers, they'd hang out, sit at the hotel bar, drink, talk. And so this is pretty common. Traveling salespeople hanging around sharing stories. Well, Bob talks about how the traveling salesman, aka the drummer's reputation, is a problem. So they're having a conversation about that. He says, in effect, that if the drummer appears, the old ladies want to hide their daughters. So that was kind of funny. But that's not only the joke, it's also the premise. The profession had a reputation problem, and Bob knew it. And this is where the play becomes more than a romantic comedy. It becomes a reputation story. Can one honest seller overcome the accumulated distrust created by sellers before him? And I'd argue that question is still valid today. Like, think about it. Like, even an honest salesperson is selling not only their solution, they're selling against every bad experience the buyer has had before them. Every fake discount, every surprise, so much of the gross that somehow still exists. Every demo that looked nothing like the implementation, every seller who disappeared right after the contract was signed. So Act 2 moves into Bob's room at the elite hotel. It's Christmas night, as we had talked about, that the room has been turned into a sample room for what he's selling, which was women's clothing. Other traveling salesmen gather there. So there was a guy named Ted Watts, Kimball, all these people. So they drink what they call tea. They're playing cards. They tease each other and complain about being stuck away from home on Christmas. Now, that part of the play is comedy, but it has a point. These men are alone on the road. They live on the road. They're fun. They're crude, sentimental, opportunistic, and human. Well, Royce, remember Royce was the guy I told you about before, that is kind of the schemer that has been sent by the prominent businessman to not be sentimental, to go after the money. Well, Royce ends up at that hotel too and joins them and eventually gets drunk. And as he's getting drunk, he starts to brag. Royce tells the rest of the guys that, hey, there's a piece of property being sold for taxes. He has inside information that the railroad needs it, and he plans to buy it cheaply and profit. Then he reveals the owner is a, quote, little country girl. Bob, it strikes him immediately that, wait, this is Beth he's talking about. And so this is the turning point in the play. Bob does something ethically messy for an ethically clean reason, though. He keeps Royce drinking, lets him pass out, and then takes his sleigh. So sleigh, think back the 1800s. This is winter. It's snowy. Instead of a horse-drawn carriage, you'd have a horse-drawn sleigh. He races to the tax sale and pays Beth's taxes so Royce cannot steal her land. So let's stop there for a second. If we were teaching this in a modern sales ethics class, we'd probably have a problem that Bob deceived Royce. He manipulated the situation. He does the wrong thing to stop a wrong thing. But dramatically, the audience is all in on Bob because his intent is protective. And in sales, intent matters, but clearly it's not enough. So we go to Act 3. The next day, Royce wakes up hungover and realizes he missed the tax sale. Then Beth arrives with a telegram. Royce learns that Bob went to the sale. So Royce does what low trust sellers have always done. He controls the narrative. He tells Beth that, hey, Bob bought her land out from under her. He tells her Bob used her. He tells her the lunch, the flirting, the kindness, all of that was a con. And of course, Beth believed him. Why? Well, because Bob is a traveling salesman. He's a drummer. She's actually known Royce longer than Bob. So it fits perfectly into the traveling salesman stereotype. When trust is low, it doesn't take much to find something like this to be totally plausible. A buyer doesn't have to do more homework. The data supports the feeling. All right? So think for a second about a competitive sales situation you're in. The buyer trusts your competitor more than you. And so if the competitor tells a lie about you, the buyer blindly believes it. That was certainly the 1800s. If the buyer already fears that salespeople hide the truth, then every little negative thing reinforces it. Now, I may be biased, but this is the power of upfront transparency. Lead with the facts, the pros and the cons upfront. It breaks the pattern, sets accurate expectations, and makes you the trustworthy one. Anyway, back to the story. So Royce and Drury, they've got this situation going on. So you've got Beth, who thinks Bob bought the land from her. Royce and Drury are the schemers who say this, right? That created this impression on Beth, and they immediately make Beth an offer. They tell her that Bob has cheated her, but they can help. That Drury then offers her money to buy the land back from Bob, and then offers to buy it from her for $5,000. Now, $5,000 at the time is a lot, and to Beth, it certainly sounds enormous, way beyond what she ever thought the land might be worth. But Bob knows the railroad right-of-way is worth much more. So now we have two sales conversations happening at once. Drury and Royce are selling certainty to Beth. Bob is there trying to sell the truth. Certainty and predictability is what triggers decisions, though. So we don't buy when we're convinced. We buy when we can predict. Royce and Drury are giving her a predictable win in her mind, but they certainly aren't being transparent. Bob has the truth, but Beth doesn't have that picture yet. And Beth no longer trusts Bob anyway. He tries to explain it to her. He tells her Royce is lying. She rejects Bob. She says he took advantage of her, insulted her with love, and robbed her. Remember, though, Bob didn't buy the land. He only paid the taxes. But by the time those words left his mouth, Beth has left the room, and only Drury and Royce are in the room to hear it. Beth actually still owns the land. So for another current lesson, if there's no trust from the beginning, no amount of truth later functions as truth. If the buyer hears the damaging version first, your explanation becomes defense. This is another one of the reasons I believe in leading with transparency, like not eventually admitting the truth, not saving the hard part until procurement, not waiting until the buyer asks the perfect question. You lead with the things they need to know to decide well. Because when the truth arrives late, it comes across as an excuse. So now we move to Act 4, and this is farce, romance, and a legal loophole, basically. Bob is desperate to find Beth before Royce and Drury close the deal. He discovers she is across the hall with a woman named Mrs. Babbitt, her older friend and kind of protector. Now, Mrs. Babbitt initially believes Beth's version of the story, but Bob walks in and walks her through the facts. He asks her to think about Royce. Has she ever trusted him? Does she really believe Royce and Drury would give Beth $5,000 unless the land was worth far more to them? This is perhaps the best persuasion moment of the play. Like, Bob doesn't just say, trust me. He helps Mrs. Babbitt reevaluate the story and restores context in the process. Trust isn't built by saying, trust me, or I'm trustworthy, or crap like I'm honest to a fault. It's through your actions, not your words, not pressure, not overcoming of objections. Restoring the context so the buyer can see clearly. Mrs. Babbitt brings Beth the receipt. Beth realizes Bob saved her land. She apologizes, but there's one more problem. Beth has already accepted the check from Royce and Drury. But at the time, as it turns out, Mrs. Babbitt knows the law and shares it that a woman cannot execute a deed without her husband's signature. So what did Bob do? He called downstairs for a minister and 2 witnesses. And that's the play, right? The curtain falls. cool stuff at the end there, right? So Bob ends up marrying Beth on the spot and won't sign the deed so that it turns out it's a false sale and she gets to keep her land. So it's stuff like this that I love finding. It's a popular play about the sales profession from over 115 years ago. There's lessons for us today throughout it. It's a historical artifact, and it's fascinating to me that The Traveling Salesman, a comedy built on distrust of sales. Once again, like when trust is gone, everything you do is immediately suspicious. You've got the drummer, the hotel room, the trunks of samples, the jokes, the flirting, and the reputation. The entire lens that made it so good and so popular is based on the fact that the person with the bad professional label and reputation is actually the only one who can be trusted here. When you as a salesperson know something important the buyer does not, anything other than sharing that, I think, is a recipe for not only disaster, but clearly ruined trust. And today, it's so much worse than back then, due to the proliferation of sharing and information and AI exposing everything. The drummer era was low trust because buyers lacked information and sellers could exploit that. We hit an era where selling did a pretty good job of rebuilding trust through service, training, and expertise, but then we went right back to pressure, manipulation, best case exaggeration, worst case outright lying, which lasted many years, and we appear to just now be digging out of it again. So, talking about a different century, but a similar issue. What does the seller do when they know something the buyer doesn't? Do you use it as leverage? Do you use it as protection? That's the profession's trust test. And maybe that's why this forgotten comedy still feels so funny and appropriate to me as I read it today. Because here we are more than 100 years later, and we're still trying to answer those same questions. Can we trust the salesperson? So there you have it. The Traveling Salesperson, the 1908 play turned into a movie. The story, the lessons that can be learned today. I guess the question is it compelling enough to reproduce it today? If anybody's interested, it's probably not me. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoy all of these episodes. Like I've said so many times, this is a hobby. This is just my outlet. And so I always so appreciate you not only subscribing and providing reviews or ratings wherever you listen to it, but just giving your time to listening in. So until next time, thanks again.